The month of April started with a new banner featuring 5 new characters, as well as a new Dokkan event featuring the first ever April Fool's characters. Dokkan Fest Int Ultimate Gohan was insane to say the least. His leader skill was still worthless unless you didn't have Gogeta obviously, but he had a supreme damage multiplier while greatly stacking attack on Super. This was a first, a unit that could greatly stack attack while having a supreme damage multiplier. Just by looking at his super attack, this guy was already looking very good, but what made him even crazier was that passive skill. Ki +5 and 10,000 attack when Ki was 7 or more. This meant that under 2 tricky leaders, you could never miss a single super attack with this guy. Like bro, you've got to understand how ridiculous that was at the time. A unit that could greatly stack attack with a supreme damage multiplier and that you could also never miss a super attack with. Like that combo was just so broken. It was so good that it got to the point that some people were even starting to debate if this guy was actually better than Gogeta. But from what I've seen, the consensus was that yes, as a unit he was indeed stronger than Gogeta, but the thing was that Gogeta was just so much more versatile. Like you could literally run him anywhere, and he also still had the best leader skill in the game. While Gohan on the other hand couldn't be ran against a physical type enemy, and his leader skill was, well, complete garbage compared to Gogeta's. Text Percent 2 Angel Goku was not bad. He had a supreme damage multiplier and a very decent passive. Ki +4 and 7,000 attack as the third attacker in turn. With his Link set, he was like the perfect floater on Gogeta's team. Or honestly any team where you needed a filler unit. Stray Gotenks on the other hand was not so great. Like sure, he had a decent leader skill if you didn't have Gogeta and a supreme damage multiplier. But his 77% attack buff as the first attacker in the turn was just not that great. Like don't forget Dokkan events at the time were still hitting pretty hard. So you wanted to have your hardest hitter in the first few slots so that you could defeat the enemy before he was able to kill you. And Gotenks was a decent hitter, it's just that the strength type was already so stacked with hard hitters like Gogeta, Broly, Super Saiyan 3 Goku, or even God Goku. So most people were choosing to run AGL Gotenks instead. He wasn't as consistent, but you weren't stuck on that one slot. The 2 new Buu units were I guess a good addition to Physical Kid Buu's team, who was actually featured on the banner if you were like a Buu fanboy, but otherwise nothing meta relevant. But don't worry, we'll talk about them later on when they'll get their Dokkan Awakenings. Especially this guy who became very good. As for Gohan's Dokkan event, well, there was no new farmable unit this time, but it did bring 2 new very good Dokkan Awakenings. Angel Ultimate Gohan, definitely the weakest of the 3, but still very good. Had a supreme damage multiplier with a 20% chance of stunning the enemy on Super, and an 80% attack buff when Ki was 6 or more. So a pretty decent consistent card, but nothing crazy. Physical Ultimate Gohan on the other hand was something else. He now officially had the second best leader skill in the game. Tricky to all types unconditionally. So pretty much Gogeta's leader skill but without the attack buff. If you didn't have Gogeta, this guy was a must run. That leader skill was just so great. He also had a supreme damage multiplier while raising his attack by 50% on Super for 3 turns. So pretty much Int Ultimate Gohan, super attack effect but only for 3 turns, which was still very good. As for his passive, he had an 80% attack when above 30% HP. So also pretty decent. The only problem with this guy, well, actually with all of the Ultimate Gohans, is that they had a shocking speed link, which made them not so great on Gogeta's team, which was built around the prepared for battle or over in a flash key link. But nonetheless, this guy was still an overall decent card. Well, as for the event itself, well, Gohan's last phase was extremely tanky unless you had a full team of Buu units. But outside of Physical Kid Buu, Buu characters were pretty much all outdated by that point. But thanks to Gogeta, you could literally just run a full team of damage dealer and brute force your way past Gohan's ultimate awakening. Gogeta was honestly just that guy, and this is why it was either you had him or your account was just not worth keeping. As for the April Fool's units, well, obviously they were meme characters, but the thing is they were actually usable as SSRs. Like they weren't great or honestly even good, but they were usable. Like I found this old Reddit post of people saying that those Yamchas were actually pretty useful for Super Strike events thanks to their low team cost and I guess alright passives. But obviously Dokkan Awakened, they were just completely worthless and just trophy cards. But still a fun event. And now that I think about it, these guys were never made farmable and there was no potential system at the time. So if you didn't save your copies and you use them instead to level their super attack, you actually will never be able to rainbow them. So I guess that's one of the downsides of being an OG. Anyways, 2 days later, they released a new filler banner, and if I'm not mistaken, the first ever type summon banner, featuring numerous AGL characters with increased rates and Z awakened characters. So actually a very good banner if you were a new player, but obviously a big skip if you're already playing for some time and still didn't have Gogeta. At the same time, they also released a new Super Strike event, Strike Cyborg Tao. had a actually not bad leader skill, tricky to strength and agile type units, so if you didn't have strength Gogeta, you could use him as your leader and use a strength Gogeta as your friend, and they would both benefit from each other's leader skills. As for his kit, it was pure RNG. He had a 20% chance of stunning on super and a 50% chance of gaining 70% attack at the start of turn. Couple that with his horrible link set, and yeah, this guy was pretty much only used for his leader skill. Well, at the time. We'll talk a little bit more about him later on. Another 2 days later, they released the tech type variant of the previous AGL type summon banner. I guess this banner was a little more hype with featured characters like Future Gohan, Super Sentai Vegeta, and Vegito, who were all decent units but nothing actually worth summoning for. 4 days later, we got another Super Strike event and a new type summon banner. Physical King Gold gave tricky to strength type units and was a debuffer, lowering the enemy attack on super and passively reducing the attack of all enemies by 25%. So probably a better card than Tao, but honestly I don't know, they were both not very good units. As for the type summon banner, it was the strength variant, and it did feature some decent options like Namek Super Saiyan Goku or Super Saiyan God Goku, but still nothing really crazy. A couple of days later, we got more stages for the Hero Extermination Plan event, giving us 2 new Dokkan Awakens. Tech Majin Vegeta was actually pretty decent. He was the second AoE unit in the game. He didn't hit as hard as Broly though, but he did have a 50% chance of stunning the attacked enemy, which was a pretty strong ability in the World Tournament. But not only that, he also had a pretty decent link set. He had 3 key links, with one of them being over in a flash, so it was way easier to launch a super attack with this guy than with Broly. Physical Majin Buu was still not great, like he was pretty much the same card but with higher stats. And since the only Buu unit that was meta relevant was Physical Kid Buu, he was pretty much his only linking partner. But the healing was quite good I guess, and could save you in some events. And I also think that his team cost was seen as pretty low at the time, so he was a decent option for Super Strike events. Majin Vegeta and Fat Buu were also featured on a new banner, the first ever double rates banner. But LRs were still not a thing at the time. There was like no potential system, so dupes weren't as valuable, and Gogeta wasn't a featured unit. So unless you were a new player or really wanted one of the featured SSR, the banner just wasn't as valuable as you would think, and probably not worth your stones. 3 days later, they released a special Super Saiyan 2 filler banner featuring 2 new characters, a Super Saiyan 2 Trunks and a Super Saiyan 2 Great Saiyaman. If you're wondering where this Trunks is coming from, well, I did some digging and apparently he's from the Budokai series. I honestly never realized that he was on Tenkaichi 3, and Trunks was like my favorite character at the time. I guess I was just so young or something, I don't know. But nonetheless, this guy was very good in Dokkan. He had the same super attack as Physical Ultimate Gohan, so a supreme damage multiplier and a 50% attack for 3 turns on super. But what made this guy insane was the fact that he was a support type unit, giving 25% attack and defense to strength type units. And if you take a look at his link set, well, you know where I'm going with this. This guy was the perfect unit to run on Gogeta's team. Not only did he support Gogeta, they also shared 3 links together. So yeah, a pretty decent card. Great Saiyaman on the other hand was just not that great. Like a supreme damage multiplier and a 70% attack above 30% HP. Like that's it, bro. I guess he did have shocking speed and prepared for battle, so he could link well with almost every Saiyan unit in the game, but still nothing special. He was just mid. 2 days later for Golden Week, they dropped an insane banner for only 77 hours, marking the return of Strength Gogeta, alongside powerhouses like Physical Polar Frieza and Strength Broly. So best believe that this was a must summon for anyone who still didn't have Gogeta. It's honestly crazy that the first ever Golden Week banner was just a rerun of Strength Gogeta. Like this guy was so good and so hyped that they didn't even bother making a new unit. They just re-released Strength Gogeta and it was enough, bro. The next day, they dropped another World Tournament, the 10th World Tournament. And just like the 7th World Tournament, they didn't change anything. But on the right side, the new World Tournament reward card was very good. In Super Saiyan, Bardock had a decent leader skill for a free play unit, 3Q and below 88% HP. It was decent if you didn't have Gogeta or Physical Ultimate Gohan. He could also seal on super attack while gaining 3K and 4000 attack when facing only one enemy. And when you couple that with the fact that this guy had 3 key links, yeah, it was very easy for him to super and seal the enemy. And if I'm not wrong, this guy was the 2nd unit ever to be able to seal, which was such a powerful ability at the time since you could seal Dokkan event bosses. So just for that, he was probably the best World Tournament reward card to date. 4 days later, they introduced the giant form mechanic into the game with a new banner and some new Dokkan Awakens. Before we dive into the cards, let's talk about the giant form mechanic. Well, it didn't change at all from today, so you would think this was a very powerful ability at the time. like to be able to turn into a giant ape, take no damage and do a lot of damage, but the problem with it is that it was just way too RNG reliant at the time. The summonable apes had a 7% chance of turning into a great ape at the start of turn, which was very low, and once they transform, there's a chance that the transformation would only last 1 turn. And don't forget the fact that if you kill an enemy and move to the next phase, you lose the transformation. So for the great ape transformation to really shine, you had to have the perfect RNG of it coming out in the last phase of a fight and lasting more than a turn, and the probability of that happening was very low. So it was a very fun mechanic, but it didn't change the meta at all. Gogeta was still the king of Dokkan and a way more reliable unit. Now, AGL Great Ape Vegeta, he had a supreme damage multiplier and a 70% attack buff when below 80% HP. So he was like okay, but when you take into account his giant transformation, he was quite decent. Like I said earlier, giant form transformation were doing a lot of damage because of their high giant ape stats and destructive damage multipliers. And since they all shared the same damage multiplier with no passive whatsoever, their stats is what made the difference, and Vegeta had the second highest giant ape stat at the time, so he was hitting very hard when transformed. But like I said earlier, it was a rare thing to see or make the best out of, but if you did, it was single-handedly the strongest ability in the game. Strength Raditz on the other hand had the lowest giant ape attack stat, but he was still hitting very hard in his giant state. As for his base kit, well, he was a nuker, and he had a decent leader skill if you didn't have Gogeta, but the problem is that his 12 key multiplier was very low for a summonable unit. He had a 12 key multiplier of 120%, which you would guess is because of the giant form transformation, but no, Vegeta had a key multiplier of 130% and Goku a key multiplier of 140%. So this guy had the lowest giant ape attack stat and the lowest 12 key multiplier. So yeah, it was not looking good for Raditz. Physical Kid Goku had a worthless leader skill, a supreme damage multiplier and a 70% attack buff when facing 2 or more enemies. So yeah, probably the worst base unit out of them, but he had the highest 12 key multiplier and giant ape attack stat, so his giant form was the hardest hitting one by far. They also renewed the Saiyan Warriors event. Our Vegeta and our Nappa were not only farmable, but they also got some new awakenings. Nappa could now be Dokkan awakened into an SSR, and Strength Vegeta could now be awakened into an SR. SR Vegeta was, I guess, an okay option in Super Strike events thanks to his damage, but that was if you didn't have Gogeta, because yes, the best strategy at the time for Super Strike events was to just run 2 Gogeta leaders and an empty team. Like, Gogeta was just so insane that you didn't even need units on your team. Like, you'd literally just run Gogeta alone and he would carry the whole team, which is crazy since it was pretty much the only way to run him because of the team cost restriction. Int Nappa Dokkan Awakening was actually very good. He could turn into a giant ape and supported Int-type units for 25% attack and defense. So even if you didn't summon on the banner, you could at least try the new giant ape mechanic with this guy. Unfortunately, he only had a 3% chance of turning into a giant ape, so it was even more rare than his summonable friends. But the biggest problem with this guy was actually his team cost. Out of all the giant ape units, he was the one with the highest team cost, which didn't make any sense since he was the free-to-play one. But I guess they wanted to balance things out since his giant ape transformation was kind of a cheat code. 3 days later, we got another Super Strike event, this time for Tech Jackie Chun, and his Super Strike Awakening was probably the best one so far. He now let Tech and Int-type units for Tricky, got the ability to sail on Super, and his Super attack buff went from 10% attack to 25% attack and defense for Tech-type units. So yeah, this guy was one of the most valuable free-to-play units at the time. The ability to sail was just so powerful in Dokkan events, the hardest content at the time, and he could do that while providing some support to your tech type units. Like, sure, there was no like highly top tier tech unit like Strength Gogeta or even close to physical full power Frieza, but those were bound to come, so best believe that this guy aged pretty well for a free play unit, as you'll see later on. They also dropped the Int type banner at the same time, which featured some units who were still somewhat decent like Vegito, Turles, or Metal Cooler, but like the previous banners, nothing really worth summoning for. The month of May started with a new Strength Super Saiyan 3 Vegeta Dokkan Fest. His leader skill, unlike other Dokkan Fests, was surprisingly not completely worthless because a lot of strength type units at the time had the over and a flash key link, and if you remember, this was still before the link level update, so key links would proc twice for the character in the second slot. So an over and a flash unit would get 6 key instead of 3 if the 2 units around him also had the over and a flash link. So yeah, this meant you could go crazy with Gogeta on his team, and if you didn't have Gogeta, you could even just run him as your main leader and use a friend Gogeta leader, and you would have a good combination of key and attack. As for his kit, well, he did have a supreme damage multiplier and a 50% chance of stunning the enemy for 2 turns on super, so this was good. But what made it even better is the fact that this guy had one of, if not the best defensive passive in the whole game, reducing damage received by 80% for 7 turns from the start of turn. So this guy could tank pretty much everything in the game. And since he was a stunner, the turn restriction didn't even matter, because by the time it would wear off, the enemy would have already been stunned or debuffed. Just an insane card. His only downside really was his damage, like it was very low. But on the bright side, he linked very well with some of the hardest hidden units in the game. He shared 4 links with Strength Gogeta and 6 links with the Super Sentry Gokus who were featured on his banner. Talking about his banner, it featured 3 new units. The new Super Saiyan Kid Goten and Trunks were pretty much the same card, and they were nothing special early, but don't worry, their time is coming. As for Torbull, well, I guess he wasn't that bad in Super Strike events. Like, he had a low team cost and could support the entire rotation for Tsuki, but that was pretty much it. As for Super Sentry Vegeta's Dokkan event, well, it came with a new Farmville Angel Super Saiyan Vegeta and the Dokkan Awakening of Tech Super Sentry Vegeta. Angel Super Saiyan Vegeta was not great. Quite frankly, he was trash and had no use whatsoever. And even to this day, the only 2 Angel Super Saiyan Vegetas are him and the Worldwide Celebration Trophy Vegeta. So honestly, that could mean that a new Angel Vegeta is coming pretty soon, but who knows? Maybe for Worldwide this year, but we'll see. Tech Super Sentry Vegeta on the other hand was actually quite good. He had the second best leader skill in the game, a supreme damage multiplier and a 70% start of turn attack buff. So a decent option if you didn't have Strength Super Sentry Vegeta, or honestly even better than his strength counterpart in some scenarios where you needed more damage and didn't really need the defense or the ki. Because yes, this guy didn't have Orva and a Flash, so his link set was way worse than his strength counterpart. As for the event itself, if you had Strength Gogeta, Angel Super Sentry Goku, or honestly any nuker, the event was fairly easy. Like, his only gimmick was that you needed to beat him under 18 hits, so about 6 turns. And since he only had 3 health bars, it really wasn't that hard. Probably the easiest Dokkan event to date. On Goku's day, they gave everyone 9 stones and dropped the physical type summon banner alongside physical Mecha Frieza Super Strike event. 2 things that had absolutely nothing to do with Goku. But I guess the 9 stones were enough. The physical type summon banner was actually pretty good. It featured physical Super Saiyan Gotenks and physical Super Saiyan Bardock. 2 units that could seal, which was, as you already know, an insane ability for Dokkan events. Physical Mecha Frieza was decent, I guess. Like, for a free-to-play unit, he did some decent damage, he could lower attack on Super, and if you had a full power Frieza, he shared 2 links with him. He also was one of the few Super Strike units that could Super at 9 ki, which was by far the best Super Strike upgrade that character could receive to his Super attack. 3 days later, we got another Super Strike event and a new filler banner. The filler banner featured a new Super Saiyan Bardock and a new Super Saiyan Goku who were both orb changers. Tech Super Saiyan Bardock was actually pretty decent. He could steal on Super, he could change strength type orbs to Tech, so a pretty decent option if you were planning on nuking an event with Tech Cell, which was still a strategy used by many players at the time. In Super Saiyan Goku, on the other hand, was just not as great. Like, he had a 20% chance of stunning on Super, which was good alongside his orb changing ability, but that's pretty much it. Their banner was also not that great. Like, it wasn't bad, just not anything special. As for the Super Strike character, AGL Paikuhan was actually a decent card if you were a new player, since he led AGL and strength type units for 3 ki, meaning you could use him as your leader with a friend Gogeta and run an AGL and strength type team. He also lowered attack while supporting the entire rotation for 50% attack when above 50% HP. 4 days later, they added some new extreme class units to the Baba Shop and re-released the God Rush filler banner. AGL Cooler was not great. Like, sure, he had the supreme damage multiplier, which was good for a free-to-play character, but his flat stat buff of 2500 attack and defense was quite low. Tech Bojack had an interesting leader skill that had some use in some niche scenarios and a 50% attack buff on Super, which looks good on paper, but he had an extreme damage multiplier, so yeah, not great. Strength Android 13 on the other hand was actually not bad. Like, he had a 30% damage reduction when ki was 8 or more, and if I'm not wrong, all those new Baba Shop units could Super at 9 ki. So when you couple that with his low team cost, he was a pretty decent option for Super Strike events, if you obviously didn't have Gogeta. I honestly still can't get over the fact that Gogeta was just so good that literally it's all you needed to beat the whole game. Just Gogeta and 6 Cybermen, bro. As for the God Rush filler banner, they added no new units to it, so the banner was even less valuable this time around. 3 days later, they dropped the 11th World Tournament. Still no changes to the rewards, and the new reward card was questionable to say the least. Physical Super Boo was not bad, I guess. Like, he lowered attack and had a very interesting passive. Recover 1000 HP per key sphere obtained. This ability was very strong, unlike a tanky team, and he linked pretty well with physical Kid Buu, but it just wasn't the right time for him, you know? Like, this meta was all about Gogeta and doing as much damage as possible, hence why the perfect previous World Tournament reward card was just so much better. The next week, the 60 million download celebration started. It obviously had your typical login rewards, but with nothing special this time around. Unlike the previous one, which gave an SR Angel Goku trophy card. They dropped a Dokkan Fest filler banner featuring In Gohan, Texel, and Strength Broly. Not a bad banner per se, but like I said a million times, not worth your stones unless you already had Gogeta. You also probably didn't know this, and I'm sorry for the low quality of the image, but that's really the best I could find. They held a campaign at the time where players could vote for which characters they wanted them to Dokkan Awaken. So pretty much like the second year anniversary LR campaign, but for Dokkan Awakenings instead. They also released the tech type banner, but this time around the characters you would pull would be fully leveled up instead, and not just leveled up to level 40. Some changes were made to the featured unit, but honestly not something worth mentioning. And the banner was obviously also not worth summoning for, especially without knowing what was coming after. The first big new banner of the celebration was a Baby Saga GT banner featuring 4 new characters. In Super Baby 2 was the first in-type Nuki leader, had a supreme damage multiplier while also lowering attack on Super, and had a 70% attack buff and above 50% HP. So yeah, this guy was actually quite decent, but nothing crazy. Strength GT Super Saiyan Goku was the first strength type Nuki leader, had a supreme damage multiplier and supported the entire rotation for 25% attack. So yes, this guy was insane. If you had all the strength type power hitters, not only did he linked well with most of them, he also gave them an unconditional 25% attack. So yeah, this guy was pretty good. The SR GT Gohan and SR Goten were pretty much useless and not worth going over. This banner also came with a new story event and a new Super Strike event. The new story event came with 2 new free-to-play units. AGL Baby Vegeta was pretty much just a reskinned AGL cooler with like a worse damage multiplier, but a better starter than a stat buff. He didn't see much use at the time, but all I can say is that it's not the last time you'll hear of this guy. Physical GT possessed Super Saiyan Goten was not bad. He gave tricky to physical type units. His drop rate was absolutely horrendous though, so most players didn't even bother farming his super attack level, since his damage was also not that great and his only use was to support physical type units, which he was obviously pretty good at. Like, tricky is nothing to laugh at. Super Strike King Vegeta on the other hand was not great. Like, all he had going for him is 4K when below 80% HP, but no additional attack buff to go with it, so he did like no damage. They also teased some new quest stages which released at the end of the month alongside a new Dokkan Fest character, pretty much the headliner of the celebration. Those new quest stages came with 2 new Baba Shop units. Int Grand Supreme Kai I guess had some use in some very niche scenarios, like his leader skill gave 20% damage reduction and he could recover 2000 HP per Int type key spheres obtained. Physical Super Saiyan Angel Goku was very good for a free-to-play character, like he had a supreme damage multiplier and an unconditional 2 key and flat stat buff of 3000 attack at the start of turn. The only problem though is that this guy was expensive. Like, one copy costed 777 incredible gems. Like, bro, if you started playing the game like 4 or 5 years ago, you already know how tedious the incredible gem farm was, so imagine at that time. Anyways, the new Dokkan Fest character was Beerus and his banner was insane, and you already know why. It featured Strength Gogeta. So if you didn't have Gogeta, this was pretty much a must summon banner. This new banner also came with a new Int God Goku, who was actually very good. He had a supreme damage multiplier and a 70% start of turn attack and defensive buff. So this guy was both good offensively and defensively, something that was very rare at the time. Tech Beerus was also quite good. His kit was nothing crazy, but he came with a reskin of the Giant Transformation, a rage mode that would proc when you were below 30% HP. He would then be invincible for 1 turn and do a lot of damage. And what was crazy about his enraged form is that it had 3 different super attacks. One that would proc when your key was between 1 and 7, a stronger one when it was between 8 and 11, and the most powerful one at 12 key. So you just couldn't miss a super attack with this guy, which was insane at the time. His Dokkan event was very hard though, probably the hardest one to date. He had a rage mechanic which made him pretty much invincible unless you had a god unit to disable it. Luckily, if you did, those Realm of Gods characters were still pretty decent and that pool was filled with stunners. His Dokkan event also came with 2 new Dokkan Awakenings. The Dokkan Awakening of SR Tech Beerus was quite good, but if you had any of his summonable variant, this guy was pretty much useless and only used as a means to raise the super attack level of other Beeruses. Strength Beerus on the other hand was now a coin flip monster. Like, he now had a 50% chance of raising his attack by 200% at the start of turn. 200%, like, bro. This buff was just insane. And when you couple that with his supreme damage multiplier and some luck, he was simply the hardest hitting unit in the game. If it weren't for Tech Beer's rage form, this guy would have probably overshadowed him completely. The month of June started with a new Super Strike event and the re-release of the AGL type banner. Strength Trunks got no upgrade whatsoever, like all they gave him is an additional 5% to his super type buff, which was pretty disappointing considering how good his SR was at the time. There's not much to say about the new AGL type banner, like I guess it did add some units to the featured pool, but nothing really worth mentioning. I think that for the most part the banner did lose some value, since AGL God Goku was now even less valuable because of in God Goku. At the same time, they also held a little campaign to celebrate the upcoming new Dragon Ball Super arc, which was the Future Trunks arc at the time if I'm not wrong, which also explains the Super Strike Trunks event and the upcoming Trunks banner that we'll go over next. 3 days later, they released a new filler banner, the second double rates banner ever, featuring an awakened physical Xeno Trunks. He was now an AoE unit, the third ever AoE unit. And even though his damage multiplier was very low, he gained 4 ki and 5000 attack when below 80% HP. So it was way easier to super with him than with Broly. So yeah, this guy went from utter trash to one of the most valuable units in the game pretty much overnight. 4 days later, they released another Super Strike event. Tech Mighty Mask was pretty much useless if you were facing one enemy, and since most of the hardest fights at the time were only against one enemy, this guy was just not that great. But he did have an extreme damage multiplier when most Super Strike cards had a huge damage multiplier and a 50% attack buff when facing multiple enemies. So against multiple enemies, this guy was hitting very hard for a free to play unit. They also released the updated in-type summon banner at the same time, which now featured in Baby. So if you're a Baby fan, this banner was maybe worth it. A couple of days later, it was already time for their $70 million celebration. Once again, there was a filler banner available for 77 hours only, featuring Strength's percentry Vegeta, in Janemba, and AGL's percentry Goku. So if I'm not wrong, the first time that Strength's percentry Vegeta ever came back. So I guess worth it if you really wanted him and obviously already had Gogeta. The main new banner came 4 days later and featured 5 new Giant Ape units. They all had a 10% chance of turning into a Giant Ape, unlike the previous Giant Ape units who had a 7% chance, but their attack stats were not equal, so some Giant Ape transformations were better than others. AGL Tora was a pretty decent unit. He gave 3 ki to all allies when below 80% HP while also lowering attack on super. His Giant Ape transformation had a 30,000 attack stat. Tech Bardock had a 70% attack buff and above 30% HP, and his Giant transformation had the highest attack stat of them all, being 35,000 attack. So he was seen by many players as the best one. And Lord Chogesh, the GOAT, gave 5,000 defense to all allies, and that was pretty much it. Like, his Giant transformation also had the lowest attack stat of the bunch alongside physical Borgos. Strength Fasha was an orb changer and I guess had the best leader skill of the bunch. Her Giant Ape transformation had also the same attack stat as AGL Tora. Physical Borgos was a Nukin type unit, getting 70% attack per key sphere obtained, so I guess alright. But honestly, this batch of Giant Ape units were pretty whack. Like, if it wasn't for their Giant Ape transformations, they would have all been horrible units and definitely not worth summoning for. Their banner also featured every single existing Giant Ape unit, so your chances of pulling a Giant Ape unit were very high. But the meta was still Gogeta, so no point really on summoning on this banner since none of these units helped Gogeta's team. The next day they dropped the B-Pen event, which was an insane event at the time. It gave just so much EXP. Strength B-Pen was also a very good unit. She could heal for 25% of the damage she dealt while also being able to super at 9 ki when her super attack level was 5 or more, which did take some time since you could only play the event once a week. 2 days later they released another world tournament, the 12th world tournament. Still no changes to the rewards, but the new reward card was pretty good. AGL Final Form Cooler had a supreme damage multiplier and gave AGL type units 30% attack and defense. Couple that with his relatively low team cost and leader skill that lowers strength type enemies attack and defense by 30%, and this guy was a monster against any strength type enemy, including the Dokkan events. At the same time they dropped a filler banner, featuring almost every orb changer in the game. Honestly, if you needed an orb changer, this banner was probably worth your stone since it gave 1 Elder Kai per multi-summon. The first banner to do so if I'm not wrong. The month ended with the Super Strike Awakening of Int Android 16. This guy was pretty much the same unit but better, so he still had the same single use of being a monster of a tank against tech type enemies. It's also not much, but worth pointing out I guess that they dropped a little Logan bonus to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the Dragon Ball anime. Well, actually it was a countdown to something, but we'll cover that in the next video.